2038, Strait of Malacca, Andaman Sea meeting point. Two unmanned submersibles crept along the ocean bottom, slowly working their way towards a large radar-indicated target ahead. It was yet hidden in the gloom, which was only punctured by the lights they bore and shone out to create a bubble of illuminated water around them. They were surrounded by the intense pressure, only matched by the unfathomable darkness of the deep ocean. They bore the only lights in a void which looked like outer space if it had become devoid of stars. A darkness which could have hid anything, from a Goliath predator to a harmless, small, curious fish. Currents pushed against them, but the subs held their course that they were instructed to follow, towards the radar-indicated target that slowly drew nearer, an anomaly which didn't belong and was soon to be showered by their lights. Above them, far above them, where the world was illuminated by the sun, a single research vessel was receiving the live footage from the subs, showing the bottom of the ocean in live, high definition. Leading the expedition was a marine archaeologist and historian named Brock Ballard, a man known for discovering a few shipwrecks around the world. Now, he was searching the Strait of Malacca and the Andaman Sea for any undocumented wrecks that were present in the region, leading a study being funded by several universities, private individuals, and historical societies to fill in some of the blank pages of history. Multiple ships had been sunk in the region during both world wars, but there had never been a major expedition to find some of them. So, with the centennial of the start of World War II approaching, many had decided it was time to change that and ensure some of the lesser-known parts of history were appropriately documented and preserved. That was the official reason anyway, though everyone on board knew that he was secretly searching for, or rather hoping to come across, one wreck in particular, now that he had a chance to actually search for it. The wreck of the legendary ghost ship, Ourang Medan, which, if it was a real ship, should have been in the region. You couldn't hope to mount an official expedition to look for the ship, unless you had the money to fund it yourself, which Ballard didn't, because most thought she never existed, so no one would fund a hunt to try and find it. But Ballard had long been fascinated with the story, and a dream of his was to prove the ship indeed did really exist. Most on board knew he'd be disappointed, but officially, the expedition was about to achieve its goal. It had been a success, even if no further wrecks were located. They'd located a wreck on the ocean floor a day earlier, and had sent 2 submersibles down that morning to document it. It was undocumented, and the exact kind of thing they'd been sent to find. Another piece of history had been found, and would soon be added to the books once they were able to film and study it. They were now less than 50 meters from the wreck, and closing the distance. Many of Brock's colleagues around the world were aware of what he'd actually wanted to find in the region, but didn't voice their concerns. Brock Ballard, despite believing in the validity of a ghost ship which had never been found in a single registry, was a well-respected marine archaeologist. He had not only discovered multiple wrecks thought lost forever, thanks to his nature to think outside the box when it came to searching for wrecks no one else had found, he was also one of only a few people to have actually seen the wreck of the RMS Titanic in person. His reputation was more than enough to make up for his believing in a fictitious ship. Everyone could have a hobby, and everyone knew he would stay on task and not go out of his way and waste time and money to try and find it. Brock was staring, his gaze fixated, at the screen as he waited for the wreck to materialize from the darkness, like a ship on the surface would eerily materialize out of the fog. The idea alone of it being the Ourang Medan was exciting, but he didn't let himself actually believe that was the ship which was ahead. He could entertain the notion for fun, but he knew that it wasn't what was waiting ahead, and didn't let himself believe it. He might have believed in the story, and thought the ship indeed did exist, but her location would be near impossible to find. They'd been scanning the sea floor in the region for signs of undocumented wrecks, due to the number of historically important ships going down in the region over the years. And at most, he hoped the wreck ahead was one of these. They had been given a list of targets which were the most desired to be found. If not one of those, it was still a wreck no one else had found, and that meant either way, the expedition was a success. And he was excited to see which one it ended up being. Brock's assistant snorted from behind him. Look at this guy. He really thinks he's going to find the Ourang Medan down there. Brock looked at him over his shoulder and shrugged. Hey, I keep an open mind. The ship is a myth, the assistant continued. Brock again just shrugged his shoulders. Hey, maybe. But that is an undocumented shipwreck ahead of the submersible, so that's something. There's a lot of known ships that it could be, and probably is. We're not sailing away empty-handed either way. Okay, fair enough. But come on. You know that won't be the Medan down there. Come on, people dying with their faces looking up at the sky with expressions of terror, an explosion so violent it threw the ship out of the water. I'm sure some details were exaggerated with retellings, Ballard replied. The Medan doesn't exist! Hey, I never said this was the Ourang Medan, or that she did. It could be anything. I'm not arguing with you on that fact. But, like I did say, I keep an open mind. Okay, pictures then. Why are there none? Cameras weren't exactly rare in the 1940s. You've been fascinated with the story for what, your whole life? So explain that one to me. Have you never questioned it? You've been itching to ask me about this, haven't you? Okay, I'll play ball. Actually, there is a supposed photo of her, showing her capsizing. I thought the ship blew up. Again, apparently so violently that it was thrown out of the water. So why would it be capsizing in the picture? Well, like I just told you, I think some details were exaggerated over the years. If anything, I'd say the more likely scenario was a small explosion rocked the ship, probably tore open the hull, and she capsized from the flooding. You can't take these stories at face value, just like the Loch Ness Monster. Also, I know some of you are taking bets on if I'll try to actually find it. No. I'm a professional, and it's not my money anyway. A voice then emitted from the static on the radio channels. She's just under 7 meters out. You should see her in the lights any time now. Ballard turned to face the screen again as the subs crept closer to the wreck. Slowly, a tall structure came into view out of the gloom, a rusting hulk of a sunken ship sitting upright on the ocean floor. Once, she might have been beautiful in her own right, but now she was merely a shadow of what she'd once been, and rusting, long forgotten, on the ocean floor with no lights or visitors. As soon as he saw it on the screen, Ballard went from joking to professional, as did everyone else. Take her up and right over the front of the bow. Let's find out what we're looking at, Ballard ordered the pilot. The lead of the two subs crept away from the ocean floor and rose up and forward until it passed over the bow of the ship. Ballard stared intently at the computer screen, broadcasting the live footage back to the research ship, taking in each detail of the wreck, looking for any clues that could give the ship her identity back. She might have once been a proud ship sailing across the untamable ocean, in a way as alive as any person, but now she was a ruin, a rusting wreck, the skeletal remains of what was once alive, forgotten on the seabed by those who lived on the surface far above, unvisited and unloved. That was how Brock always felt when he first saw a shipwreck, especially one that he was the first to discover. They always looked sad, resting on the seafloor, their rusting image a mere shadow of what they had once been so many years, sometimes centuries before. Okay, let's see what we have here. Look for any identifying aspects, Brock said, his eyes still on the screen. Looking for traits which could be used to identify the type of ship, and the specific one, was a bit of a difficult task when the only lights were those on the two unmanned subs, one passing over the forward deck while the other passed along the starboard side railing. The bow was slightly crumpled, indicating the ship might have struck the ocean floor bow and keel first, before the rest landed and settled on the seabed. The safety rails on each side of the bow were as rusted as the ship's hull, with rusticles dangling from them that looked like the stalactites you could find in caves. The forwardmost structure of the ship, the bridge, soon came into view, and the two subs maneuvered past it, one staying on the starboard side, while the other slid around to the port side. The rusted hull was dotted with shattered portholes, and the structure up on deck likewise had no glass. The bridge seemed intact. The walls were still standing, though none of the windows had glass either. The submersible on the starboard side briefly turned to look at it. The doorway was open, no door was to be seen, and the inside looked like a dark cave. A small fish lazily drifted out and out of sight into the gloom. Inside the dark room was the vague shape which couldn't be identified. It might have been part of the steering gear or the pedestal where it had once stood. After a moment, the sub turned again and began to glide alongside the ship's upper deck towards the stern. Shortly after the bridge, the deck vanished. The ship's structure had completely caved in and collapsed into a gaping hole in the deck. The metal hull was bent and ripped open into a crevasse of collapsed doorways and fallen decks. Moving both subs down the side of the ship, the team saw the hull on both sides was torn open in the same area, and the hull in the area of the ship, resting half buried into the muddy seabed, had parts jutting out like something had blasted out of the ship. "What do you think?" Brock asked the man sitting to his left. The man was an expert on old ships from the region, named Andrew Dave Morrison. He had a head of white hair, was slightly overweight, wore a faded baby blue shirt, and had thinly framed glasses resting on his nose. He was gazing hard at every frame of the live feed. "Cargo ship of some kind, most likely. Judging from the bow and parts of the superstructure we can see, I'd say maybe Dutch or British build. Probably built in either the 1930s or 1940s, he said, leaning forward and taking in more details of the superstructure. Actually, maybe even 1920s. From what I've seen of her body and shape, she kind of reminds me of the British steam merchant Trickerel, as far as design goes, which was completed in 1919 and sank in 1941. But that's probably just my mind filling in the gaps based on what I've seen of her. She probably looked more like this, actually, he added, opening a laptop and going to a database of pictures, pulling up one of the Dutch freighter SS Chapara, taken in 1942. "Probably also something sank in World War II?" Ballard suggested, and Morrison nodded. "Yeah, probably. But that damage doesn't look like a bomb was dropped on them. That looks more like they blew up from the inside." Seeing the look on Ballard's face at the comment, Morrison shook his head and added, "Well, don't get too excited now. Probably some of that damage comes from being down here for almost a century," he said, and Ballard nodded in agreement. "I want to know what this ship is. Are there any which were lost in World War II that you know sank in this area?" Ballard asked. Morrison shook his head. "I don't know, not off the top of my head. Like I said, it looks like a Dutch freighter from the era, likely very similar looking to the Japara, but we can't know for sure until we see the whole wreck. But a lot of freighters were sunk in the war. More than we probably know about. Cargo ships were targets for obvious reasons. They didn't just carry supplies, but also troops. It would just take a Japanese plane flying overhead and a ship being in the wrong place at the wrong time. We need to look around for any features which we can match to known missing ships from the era, and if we can't find that, then features that tell us exactly what type of ship she is at least." Brock continued staring at the damage he was seeing in the live feed, and sat up abruptly. "Take the submersibles back to the bow," he said. "I've got a feeling." He trailed off, and the pilots did as told, turning both subs around and following them back along the sides of the ship back to the bow. "Right there. Look at that. What is that?" Ballard said, jumping out of his chair and pointing at something on the starboard side bow. A small wooden plaque was coming into view from out of the gloom. If there had been one on the port side, it was gone, so both subs converged on the starboard side plaque. "Is that a nameplate?" someone asked. "It is, and it's not corroded," Ballard replied. "That's because it's made of teak," the expert chimed in. Covering the nameplate was a thick layer of sediment, which rendered it unreadable, but Ballard wasn't dissuaded. "Hold the closer sub in place, right in front of it. Bring the other around and gently brush the buildup off," he ordered. Everyone watched with bated breath as the second sub crept in close and began scrubbing the grime off the teak plate. As it did, the first sub kept its lights trained on the plaque and letters began to become visible underneath the buildup as sediments were scrubbed away. Everyone was only able to stare in total, stunned silence as the name Ourang Medan became visible, perfectly preserved on the plaque despite the hull around it rusting and rotting in the live camera feed. The second sub pulled back and pointed its cameras at the plaque too, showing the name clearly in both feeds. Like a haunting specter, the most famous ghost ship in history had just, finally, revealed herself for the first time. "I'll be goddamned," Ballard said. For the next several hours, the researchers scrambled to collect data. They couldn't get the two subs around the ship fast enough in their excitement. Ballard, in particular, was like a kid in a candy store. They didn't announce their discovery yet, only sharing to colleagues back in the United States that they had located an undocumented wreck. Ballard chose to keep the wreck's identity secret until they not only fully mapped and documented it, but also swept through the surrounding area for additional debris. At the end of the expedition, Ballard was going to be presenting the findings of it to a gathering of experts and the press, with the public being able to watch the event live over the internet. They were all in for a treat even greater than they could have imagined, and Ballard could only imagine what the reaction would be when he did finally share with everyone the identity of the wreck. For hours, the two subs slowly worked their way around the wreck, but that massive open hole in the center of the ship yearned, and eventually, Ballard could not hold in his curiosity anymore. Some of the rooms in the exterior superstructure had been investigated, the bridge, for example, and they'd even found the wireless room, with the wireless set which sent out the infamous SOS still sitting on the bolted-down table. But Ballard wanted to see the inside of the hull. One of the longest unanswered mysteries about the Ourang Medan was, if she was real, then what killed her crew? Did she have some hazardous cargo on board which was responsible? I want to see if we can't get down inside the hull. Can we get down inside the ship through the damage section? Ballard asked 2 hours after they'd identified the ship. The lead sub was currently filming the bridge, its lights trained on an overturned locker lying rusted but intact on the floor. The sub backed up out of the doorway and maneuvered towards the aft section of the wreck. The operator shook his head. "Maybe. You realize the ship's been down here for 90 years, right? We nudge anything inside her and the whole structure might collapse." "Hey, we just proved one of the greatest ocean mysteries of all time did indeed occur. Now I want to know if we can't find any clues about what killed her crew." The torn open section of the hull came into view, and the sub detached an ROV down into the collapsed section. Amid the torn metal and fallen decks, one black doorway appeared near the bottom, an intact hallway which was unobstructed. "Go in, right there," Ballard said, pointing at the screen and jumping slightly. "Calm down, I see it," the operator replied, feeling fed up already. He urged the smaller robot forward into the dark opening, the lights illuminating a long hallway, free of blockage. "Just think," Ballard said as the ROV eased further inside and illuminated more of the hull and its lights. "We're seeing a place no one has seen for nearly a century." The ROV moved further along the hull, the deteriorated walls still holding the ceiling up. Open doorways leading into dark rooms appeared on either side, but the ROV kept moving forward, and Ballard kept his gaze on the screen the feed was being sent back to. "Hey, is there access to the cargo holds on this level?" Ballard asked. One of the theories about the disaster was that the cargo had something to do with the crew's death. "Should be if we're on the right deck, but with all the damage outside, I'm not sure which we're on exactly. This hallway, though, should lead to a door which leads to the hold if we're on the right one," Morrison answered. The ROV crept deeper into the wreck. The interior of the ship seemed in relatively good condition, despite both the violent end she endured before sinking and spending nearly a century underwater. She was certainly fragile, though, and the operator kept the ROV clear from the walls to avoid any kind of scrape or collision. There, Ballard suddenly said, jumping up and pointing at the end of the hallway, which was beginning to emerge from the gloom. There's an open hatch, and it looks like there's a big open space behind it. The operator took his hands off the ROV control for a moment in frustration, and the ROV stopped moving and lightly settled on the hallway floor, slightly stirring up the sediments. I got it, he sighed. Just relax. I get you're excited, but calm down. I don't need a coach. I got this. He urged the vehicle forward again, further down the hallway, and soon the open hatch came fully into view. Behind was a cavern of darkness, and the end of a collapsed catwalk was visible just behind the doorway. Ballard clapped his hands and smiled. Cargo hold, baby, get in there! The ROV slowly crept forward and squeezed through the opening. The hatch was still on the hinge and swung fully open. Seeing that it was left open, Ballard turned to Morrison. Those types of hatches were watertight. Do you think if it was closed it would have kept the ship from sinking? Morrison shook his head. Not if she sank as fast as the story says she did. One closed watertight hatch would make a difference with that kind of damage. They watched as the ROV moved through the open door and into the open space, out of the claustrophobic hallway and down into the void below, going slow in case of any unseen debris which might loom out of the darkness unexpectedly. The open room of the hold was like a black void or an underwater cavern, and the lights could not reach the wall, making the space feel much larger than it probably really was. Some twisted, rusted metal came into view as the ROV descended, and the operator moved it aside to avoid the collapsed catwalk. The last thing they needed was the ROV to be caught on that. It would be as stuck as the Spirit rover on Mars became. As the ROV descended deeper into the gloom, into the bowels of the dead ship, the floor of the hold finally came into view. A thick layer of muddy sediment had built up on the floor, but a pile of round objects came into view. What are those? Ballard asked, pointing as the objects barely came into view on the cargo hold floor. The objects weren't buried, as the sediments had built up on the opposite side of the hold than where the objects were laying. The operator moved the ROV to the left to shine more light on the round objects. One light directly hit them, and it became obvious what they were. Barrels. Maybe some kind of chemical drums? The sub-operator said, moving the ROV closer to the hold floor. It snaked its way down, and indeed the objects were revealed in its close-up lights to be rusted metal drums of some kind, toppled over with their lids long gone. What hold are we in? Ballard asked, turning away from the monitor. Morrison was looking at the RV feed and paused. Well, if we compare the Ourang Medan, based on what we've seen, to other similar Dutch cargo ships from the time, probably cargo hold 3. That's one compartment forward of where the fire started, Ballard muttered. He looked back at the live feed on the monitor and asked, That ROV has arms, right? The operator nodded. Grab one of those barrels. I want to see if we can't find out what was in them. The operator nodded and activated the ROV's arms. He moved the robot closer and stopped just above one of the barrels and extended the claw-like hands out and grasped onto one of the barrels by its lip. Careful, careful. Easy now. Easy, easy, Ballard urged as the operator attempted to lift the barrel up off the floor. Immediately, a bunch of sediment was kicked up and the metal began to break apart. Forget it, stop, Ballard said, and the operator released his grasp on the barrel. The crumbling metal drum fell back to the hold floor. Try with one of the other ones, Ballard urged. The operator obliged and moved to one of the other barrels, one on top of a small pile of others. He grasped it with the claws and began to lift. Careful, careful. Easy, easy, Ballard said. I got it, the operator assured. The drum managed to hold together as it was lifted up off the pile. Okay, flip it over, Ballard said, and the ROV operator again obliged. He flipped the barrel over and dropped it back into the pile, kicking up more sediments which needed to clear. As they did, the barrel came back into view on the camera amid the murk and floating mud, and everyone saw, amid the rust and corrosion, the faint letters stamped onto it, still clearly visible amid the rust, which read, GA, Variant B. For the second time that day, as he stared at the possible answer to one of the most mysterious, unsolved maritime mysteries in history, Brock Ballard said the words, "I'll be goddamned." Indicating the ship might have struck the ocean floor bow and keel first before she landed on the indicating the ship might have struck the indicating the ship might have struck the ocean floor bow and keel first before she oh my god indicating the ship might have struck the ocean floor bow and keel first before the rest landed and settled on the seabed. The safety rails on each side of the bow were as rusted as the ship's hull, with rusticles dangling from them that looked like the stalactites you'd found in caves. Indicating the ship might have struck the ocean floor bow and keel first before the rest landed and settled on the seabed. The lead sub was currently filming the bridge, its lights trained on an overturned locker lying rusted but intact on the floor. The sub backed up out of the doorway and maneuvered towards the aft section of the wreck. He flipped the barrel over and dropped it back onto the pile, kicking up more sediment which needed to clear.